Hello everyone, today we are talking about the Xpro3 and actually this also applies to the Xt4 that was recently released. So we'll be talking about the HDR versus the DR functions in both of those cameras, and right here I have the Xpro3, beautiful camera. So today we're going to sort out any confusion that you have over the HDR versus the DR functions within these cameras. So let's talk about what you can expect from using both of these settings. So things that they have in common include that they're both going to decrease the contrast that you have in your overall picture. So you'll either gain more detail in the highlights or the shadows. Also, both of these settings are intended to be used when you have a high contrast scene. So if you have the sunlight directly hitting your subject, or if you have a portrait against a bright sky, both the HDR and the DR functions will help out with that situation. With both of these, you really only need to consider using them if you are doing JPEG straight out of the camera. If you're shooting RAW, that's a different story. It is important to note that if you do shoot RAW, there are some circumstances in which you could apply the HDR or the DR function with the internal RAW processing. Also, one more commonality between these two is that you can get some mottling, which is also known as color smearing, in the picture at the higher values. So these are both really intended to be used with intent and really not overused. All right, so what are some of the differences between these two methods of increasing the detail in either your highlights or your shadows? So basically with the dynamic range option, you have an option to set it at auto, 100%, 200%, or 400%. Obviously at the higher value, like at 400%, you're going to get more detail in your picture. With the dynamic range function, once you start playing around with this in your camera, you'll realize that you can only set it to 200% if you are 320 ISO or above, and then you can only set it at 400% if you are 640 ISO or above. So basically what the DR function is going to do for your pictures is that it's going to use that higher ISO value to boost the detail in the shadows while keeping the exposure for your highlights down. So this is why if you're at the value of 200%, you need an ISO of 320 or above, and if you're at a value of 400%, you need an ISO value of 640 or above. So basically it's just taking that higher ISO and boosting the shadows in your picture with it. Okay, so let's talk about what the HDR function does to your photos. So to get to HDR, you actually need to go into your drive mode and then go down to where it says HDR. I know you can't see that, but it says HDR. So for this mode, you have the options of 200%, 400%, 800%, or plus. What the camera does is it takes multiple exposures and then blends them together. Again, same thing, the higher the value, the more detail that you're either going to get in your shadows or your highlights. It's basically the same thing that your iPhone is doing. And also it's very similar to what you would do in post-processing in Lightroom if you were making an HDR photo. Now there's definitely some things that you should know about this, and when I learned about these, I've been a little bit more hesitant to use this mode. So basically there's a very slight crop in your photo when you're using this mode. And the reason that the camera does that is because it's auto-aligning the multiple exposures that it took. So using this mode will actually result in a softer image. I'm guessing that this probably occurs when the camera is aligning the photos and blending everything together. What you can do to counter this is you can go into your camera settings and increase your sharpness and your clarity for your photo to recover some of that detail. Also with the HDR mode, it's definitely more important to keep your camera steady when you are taking the pictures, since there are multiple exposures. One more thing to note about this mode is that you can't use flash when you are in HDR mode. So what are some best case scenarios to use these different modes in? So for dynamic range, I would say that I would use that mode if I were taking pictures of faster moving subjects, maybe in dynamic environments where things are moving, or if I was taking a landscape photo where there was a lot of wind or there was moving water. I would also use this mode if I were taking a photo handheld in lower lights. For the HDR mode, I would probably use that if I were in a situation where I needed to recover more detail in my highlights and my shadows than I could if I were using the dynamic range function. Also, if I wanted a quick HDR picture and I was in a bright environment where nothing was moving, I could use that mode too. So for some closing thoughts, I think that for the majority of the time, I probably wouldn't bother shooting in either of those modes. I like to shoot RAW, so I have more flexibility with my post-processing, but that being said, if I were just shooting around the house, taking some family photos, or if I was on vacation and I wanted to stick to JPEG images, I might be more inclined to maybe tweak the in-camera settings and increase the sharpness and clarity and maybe use that HDR mode more. And also the dynamic range mode, even though it just goes up to 400%, still works really well. And if you're shooting JPEGs and have a little bit of that noise reduction on, you really can't even tell. Otherwise, if you're shooting RAW, I would just stick to the old school method and shoot some multiple exposures, import it into Lightroom or Photoshop or any other photo editing software that you have that can combine the exposures into an HDR image. That way you won't be losing any image quality in the photo. I hope you guys were able to learn something new from this video, and if you liked the content, please subscribe and like my channel. I am excited to get to 1,000 subscribers. For my next video, I was thinking about doing a quick review on this 27mm Fuji lens right here. Awesome pancake lens. I highly recommend it. But yeah, so let me know if you want to see that. All right, I'll talk to you later.